If you're seeing this now, it's not because you were looking for it. It's because something in you was ready to notice. Timing is never random in matters of awareness. Messages that challenge perception don't land. When life is calm and comfortable, they surface when something underneath the surface begins to feel wrong. A quiet tension, a sense that events are accelerating, compressing, overlapping, days blur, attention fractures. And yet, amid the noise, a moment of clarity breaks through. That moment is now. Not because the world is ending, but because perception is narrowing and windows of insight don't stay open indefinitely. Throughout history, there have always been periods when awareness expands and periods when it contracts, when people feel free to question and when questioning quietly disappears. These shifts don't happen overnight. They unfold gradually, almost politely, so that most people never notice what they're losing. The ability to concentrate, the patience to think deeply, the instinct to trust inner knowing. These don't vanish suddenly, they erode. And erosion is easy to ignore until the structure collapses. Right now, humanity is being pulled into speed, faster information, faster reactions, faster conclusions. The pace itself becomes the distraction. When everything feels urgent, nothing is examined. When attention is constantly redirected, it never settles long enough to see clearly. This is not simply a byproduct of technology or modern life. It is a condition being normalized, a state where presence feels uncomfortable and stillness feels foreign. And that state is ideal for steering perception without resistance. You're seeing this now because moments of recognition don't announce themselves with certainty. They arrive as unease, as a question you can't quite articulate, as the feeling that waiting for later may be the same as missing it entirely. Most people don't reject truth outright. They postpone it. Tomorrow, after work, when things slow down, when life feels safer. But postponement is how awareness closes quietly without drama. The system that shapes perception does not need to silence everyone. It only needs to delay them. Delay until attention weakens. Delay until curiosity dulls. Delay until distraction feels normal and questioning feels exhausting. That is why urgency feels uncomfortable. It cuts through habit. It interrupts the trance of "I'll deal with this later." And that interruption is precisely what makes moments like this rare. If you're here now, it doesn't mean you're special. It means you're still attentive, still capable of pausing long enough to notice the pressure building beneath everyday life, still able to sense that something essential is being squeezed out, not taken violently, but crowded out by noise, fear, and endless stimulation. Awareness does not disappear because it is attacked. It disappears because it is neglected. This chapter is not a warning of catastrophe. It is a reminder of timing. Awareness operates in windows. When the mind is saturated and reactive, insight cannot land. When fear dominates attention, curiosity retreats. But when a crack appears, a pause, a question, a moment of quiet recognition, clarity can enter. Those cracks are becoming rarer, not because truth is vanishing, but because attention is being consumed. You're not too late, But this moment matters, not in a dramatic, apocalyptic sense, but in a subtle, psychological one. What you give your attention to now shapes what you will be able to perceive later. Awareness is like a muscle: engaged, it strengthens; ignored, it weakens. And the world you will experience tomorrow depends on what you are willing to see today. This is why you're seeing this now, not because someone chose you, but because you haven't fully checked out. Because part of you still notices when reality feels rushed, shallow, or incomplete. Because something in you understands that clarity rarely arrives when it's convenient. And because once attention slips entirely into reaction and distraction, it becomes much harder to step back. This is the opening of the window. Not forever, not dramatically, just briefly. And what you do with this moment determines whether the rest of the message will make sense at all. What most people don't realize is that awareness is not guaranteed. It is a living capacity that can expand or contract depending on how it is used. Consciousness does not vanish dramatically. It narrows. It becomes shallow. It loses depth quietly while life continues on the surface as normal. This is how awareness closes, not through force, but through neglect. And right now, that narrowing is accelerating at a scale humanity has never experienced before. Look at how difficult it has become for people to remain present. Attention jumps constantly, pulled by alerts, headlines, images, sounds, and endless demands. Moments of silence feel uncomfortable, even threatening. Stillness is mistaken for boredom. Reflection is replaced with reaction. This is not simply a cultural shift, it is a neurological one. The human nervous system is being trained to exist in a state of permanent stimulation, where depth becomes inaccessible and clarity feels unnatural. When attention fragments, awareness follows. You cannot perceive deeply when your mind is constantly pulled elsewhere. You cannot question reality when you are overwhelmed by it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ability to think beyond immediate impressions weakens. People begin to rely on shortcuts, headlines instead of understanding, opinions instead of insight, emotion instead of discernment. This is not stupidity. It is conditioning. Awareness closes when curiosity is replaced by certainty. When people stop asking why and start repeating, "This is just how things are," the most dangerous phrase in any era is not a lie. It is, "There's nothing we can do." That sentence signals that awareness has contracted enough to accept limitation as truth. And once limitation is accepted internally, it no longer needs to be enforced externally. This narrowing is reinforced through constant urgency. Everything is framed as immediate, critical, and demanding response. But when everything is urgent, nothing is examined. Urgency keeps awareness shallow. It forces attention into survival mode, where perception is limited to threat and relief. In that state, deeper questions cannot form. They feel irrelevant, even irresponsible. This is how people are trained to abandon reflection willingly. What makes this moment different from any other time in history is scale and speed. Never before has human attention been captured so completely, so consistently, and so early in life. Children grow up without ever knowing sustained focus. Adults struggle to remember what uninterrupted thought feels like. Memory weakens. Identity blurs. And when people lose a stable sense of inner continuity, they become increasingly dependent on external cues to tell them who they are and what matters. This is the quiet cost of awareness closing. Not sudden collapse, but gradual numbness. A sense that something important is missing without the clarity to name it. People feel disconnected, anxious, restless, but unable to trace the cause. They look outward for solutions, new distractions, new identities, new causes, while the real loss happens inwardly. The loss of the capacity to see beyond the surface. And once awareness contracts past a certain point, reopening it becomes difficult. Not impossible, but resisted. Depth feels uncomfortable. Silence feels threatening. Questions feel destabilizing. The mind, having adapted to constant stimulation, interprets stillness as danger. This is how people come to fear the very space in which clarity arises. This is why timing matters. Not because of some external deadline, but because perception itself has thresholds. When awareness is engaged, insight flows naturally. When it is neglected, insight feels foreign. You are seeing this now because your awareness has not fully closed. There is still enough space to pause, to reflect, to sense that something deeper is being obscured. But that space is not guaranteed to remain open. Awareness, like any capacity, must be used to stay alive. And that is the quiet urgency behind this message. Not panic, not fear, attention, because once awareness closes completely, people don't feel trapped, they feel normal. And that is when the window truly disappears. Most people don't reject truth, they postpone it. That is the trap. Not denial, not outrage, not even disbelief, but delay. Tomorrow, after this week, when life calms down, when there's more time, waiting feels reasonable, responsible, safe. And that is exactly why it works so well. Because awareness does not close with a slam of a door. It fades while you're busy convincing yourself there will always be another moment to look more deeply. The system does not need you to say no. It only needs you to say later. Waiting is presented as patience, but it is often avoidance dressed up as common sense. The mind tells itself that now is not the right time to question deeply, to reflect honestly, to sit with discomfort. There are bills to pay, messages to answer, obligations to meet, and all of that is real, but it is also endless. There will always be something demanding attention. If awareness is postponed until conditions are perfect, it will never arrive. The trap works because it aligns perfectly with modern life. This is how people miss critical moments of recognition. Not because they weren't intelligent enough to see, but because they were too distracted to stop. The signal is subtle, a feeling that something doesn't add up, a sense of unease beneath normal routines, a fleeting clarity that appears and disappears, and instead of following it, people return to motion. They scroll, they work, they react. They tell themselves they'll come back to it. Most never do. Waiting also feels harmless because it carries no immediate cost. Nothing bad happens when you postpone awareness. Life continues, you function, you adapt, and that is precisely the danger. The cost of waiting is cumulative, not sudden. Each postponement weakens the habit of attention. Each delay reinforces distraction. Over time, the capacity to pause erodes, and with it, the ability to recognize when something truly matters. This is why urgency feels uncomfortable. It interrupts routine. It challenges the belief that there will always be time. It asks for attention now before the mind can negotiate itself back into sleep. Urgency is not about panic, it is about timing. There are moments when awareness can open easily and moments when it resists. Missing those windows does not bring punishment, it brings numbness. The system understands this better than most people do. It does not rush you toward truth, it rushes you away from it. It fills your days so completely that reflection feels indulgent. It frames deep questioning as impractical. It rewards speed over depth, reaction over understanding. And because waiting feels self-directed, people believe they are choosing it freely. That is the elegance of the trap. Waiting also allows fear to do its work quietly. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers that you're not ready, not informed enough, not stable enough to question foundational assumptions. It tells you that looking too deeply might disrupt your life, your relationships, your sense of certainty, and so you wait for a safer moment, one that never arrives. Fear doesn't need to stop you, it only needs to slow you down. This is why so many people look back and say they always felt something was off, but never acted on it. The feeling was real, the timing was missed. Awareness requires engagement. It does not grow on its own. It responds to attention like a flame, responds to oxygen, starve it long enough, and it dims. If you're hearing this now, it's because the trap hasn't fully closed. You are still capable of noticing the pull toward delay, still able to feel the difference between distraction and discernment, still able to recognize that later is not neutral, it is directional. It always points away from presence. This chapter is not asking you to panic or abandon your life. It is asking you to notice how often you defer attention to what matters most. Because once waiting becomes automatic, awareness becomes optional. And when awareness becomes optional, control becomes effortless. That is why timing matters. Not because something external will happen tomorrow, but because the habit of waiting, left unchallenged, becomes the mechanism by which people quietly lose the ability to see at all. At some point, honest observation leads to a conclusion that is difficult to ignore. The manipulation of awareness does not happen randomly or clumsily. It unfolds with timing, rhythm, and psychological precision. Events do not simply occur, they arrive in sequences. Pressure builds, releases briefly, then tightens again. Moments of clarity appear, followed by waves of distraction. This is not chaos, it is orchestration. And the most important thing to understand is that whoever or whatever is shaping this process understands human attention far better than most humans understand themselves. This intelligence does not operate through constant force. It operates through cycles. Expand, contract, reveal, obscure, calm, crisis. When awareness begins to rise, distraction intensifies. When people start asking deeper questions, noise increases. When stillness threatens to return, urgency is injected. The goal is not to eliminate awareness entirely, but to keep it unstable, never settling long enough to mature into discernment, because immature awareness is easy to redirect. Timing is central to this strategy. The system does not want people to wake up all at once. It wants staggered attention, fragmented realization, partial insight that never consolidates into clarity. This is why so much information is available, yet so little is integrated. People are exposed to fragments of truth without the space to process them. Insight without integration leads to confusion, not liberation. And confusion sends people back into familiar narratives where authority waits patiently. Notice how often moments of global reflection are followed by sudden distraction. A crisis emerges, people pause, question, reflect, and then something else demands immediate attention. The reflection is cut short, the momentum is lost. Over time, people stop trusting their own instincts to pause at all. They learn that nothing stays still long enough to examine. That sense of constant motion is not accidental. Movement prevents seeing patterns. Speed dissolves context. This intelligence understands something fundamental. Awareness has thresholds. There are moments when people are receptive and moments when they are closed. Rather than trying to force insight into closed minds, the system simply waits. It exhausts attention. It overwhelms emotion. It fragments focus. And when awareness weakens, it moves again. Not dramatically, but incrementally. Changes introduced slowly feel natural. Restrictions accepted temporarily become permanent. Narratives repeated often enough feel self-evident. Importantly, this intelligence does not require centralized control. It works through self-reinforcing systems. Media reacts to fear because fear captures attention. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage keeps people engaged. Institutions follow incentives without questioning the deeper pattern they serve. No single individual needs to understand the whole for the whole to function. That is the brilliance of it. Control without a controller that can be easily pointed to. This also explains why timing feels personal, why some people encounter these ideas and feel nothing, while others feel an immediate recognition. Awareness does not arrive on command. It emerges when conditions allow. And right now, conditions are tightening, not closing completely, but narrowing. The space for reflection is being squeezed by speed, urgency, and emotional saturation. That is why messages like this feel different now than they might have years ago. The background pressure has changed. The system understands that once awareness stabilizes, it is extremely difficult to reverse. A person who has seen patterns clearly does not unsee them. That is why the emphasis is always on disruption before stabilization, confuse before clarity sets in, distract before insight deepens, delay before recognition integrates. The enemy of control is not information, it is sustained awareness. This is also why fear-based reactions are encouraged when people begin to wake up. Fear destabilizes. It pushes attention outward. It replaces observation with reaction. People who encounter unsettling ideas are nudged toward panic or obsession rather than calm discernment. Either extreme pulls them away from grounded awareness, where real understanding would form. But here is the critical point. Timing cuts both ways. Just as awareness can be delayed, it can also consolidate quickly when recognized. A single moment of clear seeing can reorganize perception permanently. That is why these windows matter. Not because of prophecy or prediction, but because perception itself is at a crossroads. If you are still able to pause, still able to reflect, still able to sense that something deeper is unfolding beneath the noise, then you are ahead of the contraction. Not superior, just attentive. And attention is the one variable the system cannot fully control. Which leads to the next question. If timing is being managed so carefully, what happens to those who remain distracted until the window closes? What is the cost, not dramatic, but psychological, of missing the moment? That is what the next chapter confronts. When the window closes, nothing dramatic happens, no alarms sound, no announcements are made. Life continues, routines persist, conversations repeat themselves, and the world appears outwardly the same. That is what makes this moment so difficult to recognize. The closing of awareness is not an event. It is a condition, a gradual settling into shallowness that feels normal because it is shared. People don't feel trapped. They feel busy. They don't feel silenced. They feel distracted. And by the time they notice something is missing, they can no longer name what it was. The first thing that fades is discernment, not intelligence, not memory of facts, but the ability to sense depth. Everything begins to feel flattened, important and trivial blend together. Emotional reactions replace thoughtful response. People become certain more quickly and curious less often. Questions that once felt urgent now feel exhausting. Reflection feels like a luxury that no one has time for. This is not ignorance. It is fatigue of awareness. As discernment weakens, dependence increases. People look outward for cues on how to think, feel, and respond. Authority becomes comforting, not because it is trusted, but because it removes responsibility. Narratives are accepted not because they are convincing, but because they are familiar. The need to belong overrides the need to understand, and gradually the idea of questioning foundational assumptions begins to feel disruptive rather than necessary. The next loss is inner continuity. When attention is permanently fragmented, experiences stop integrating into meaning. Days blur together. Events are remembered emotionally, but not coherently. Identity becomes unstable, defined more by immediate circumstances than by an inner sense of direction. People feel restless, anxious, or numb without understanding why. They seek stimulation to fill the gap, not realizing the gap is the absence of depth itself. This is where control becomes effortless. Not because people are forced, but because they are unanchored. A person without a stable inner reference point will cling to whatever offers certainty. Even if that certainty is artificial, they will defend narratives that give them identity, even if those narratives limit them. They will resist anything that threatens the fragile equilibrium they built around distraction and routine. Importantly, this is not a moral failing, it is a consequence. Awareness, like any capacity, weakens when unused. When reflection is consistently postponed, the mind adapts to speed. When stillness is avoided, silence feels hostile. When questioning is deferred long enough, it feels unnecessary. People don't choose this state consciously. They drift into it while believing they are simply coping with life. Despite everything you've heard, despite the narrowing of awareness, the speed, the noise, and the quiet erosion of depth, a choice still exists, and it exists now. Not later, not after the next distraction passes, not when life becomes more convenient. The choice is not dramatic. It does not require rebellion or belief. It requires attention. The simplest, most overlooked act in the modern world, to pause and observe without immediately reacting. That pause is the hinge on which everything turns. The system relies on momentum, on keeping you moving just fast enough that you never fully arrive. When you pause, momentum breaks. When momentum breaks, patterns become visible. And when patterns become visible, the spell weakens. This is why the choice is quiet rather than heroic. It does not announce itself with certainty. It asks for presence. And presence is the one thing the system cannot manufacture for you. Choosing awareness does not mean withdrawing from the world. It means engaging with it differently. You still work, speak, act, and decide, but from observation rather than reflex. You notice fear as it appears. Instead of identifying with it, you recognize urgency as a signal rather than a command. You sense when your attention is being pulled and choose whether to follow. These are small acts, almost invisible, but they accumulate into a profound shift. Control depends on unconscious participation. Awareness withdraws consent without confrontation. This is why awakening does not spread like a movement. It stabilizes person by person. Not everyone will make this choice, and that is not a failure. Awareness cannot be forced open. It opens when it is used. Some will remain comfortable within speed and certainty. Others will feel an increasing discomfort that leads them to slow down. Timing differs, but the mechanism is the same. Attention determines perception. Perception détermine expérience. The choice that exists now is to reclaim stillness in small, deliberate ways, to allow moments without input, to sit with questions without rushing toward answers, to feel discomfort without escaping it immediately. These are not techniques, they are permissions. Permission for awareness to reassert itself beneath the noise. When this happens, clarity emerges not as a revelation, but as a recognition, something familiar returning after a long absence. As clarity stabilizes, fear loses leverage. Not because threats disappear, but because fear requires imagination running ahead of the present moment. Presence interrupts that process. When you are here, fear has nowhere to anchor. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You respond when response is necessary. You act when action aligns. You stop donating energy to manufactured conflict. And in doing so, You quietly step outside the loop that depends on your reactivity. The choice also involves responsibility. Not blame, not guilt responsibility for where attention goes. The world will continue to compete for it relentlessly. That will not stop. The question is whether you notice the pull and choose deliberately, or whether you drift by default. Responsibility is not heavy when it is honest. It becomes heavy only when it is avoided. What happens next does not require prediction. The outcome is internal before it is external. A person who chooses awareness experiences the world with depth rather than haste, meaning returns without being sought. Identity stabilizes without being defended. You still encounter uncertainty, but you are no longer defined by it. This is not escape, it is alignment. And this is why the window matters. Not because it closes forever, but because habits form quickly. Attention, once reclaimed, strengthens. Neglected, it weakens. The choice is available now because enough space still exists to make it. That space is precious, not mystical, just practical. Use it and it grows. Ignore it and it shrinks. If you're hearing this and it resonates, the choice is already in motion. You are not late, but you are not early either. You are here. And here is where awareness lives. Not in promises, not in fear, not in tomorrow. Here. That is the choice that still exists, and it is enough.